Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri, USPIE's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sheri delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri. I'm your host, Sheri, and I'm thrilled you're tuning in today. This podcast is all about shining a light on the problems in government education. Problems like declining academic standards, harmful teaching methods pushed by federal agencies, and the widening gap between schools and the communities they're supposed to serve. Here we dive deep into these challenges and explore solutions that put parents and local communities back in control. Whether you're a parent, a grandparent, or just someone who loves this country and wants to protect the freedoms our forefathers fought to provide, this podcast is for you. Every week, we'll bring you compelling interviews and the most important education news to help you understand what's at stake and what you can do to make a difference. Together, we can fight back against the forces undermining our children's future and say with conviction, not on our watch. So if you're ready to stand up for your kids, your grandkids, and the future of this great nation, you're in the right place. Be sure to follow the podcast and visit USPIE.org to learn more and join the movement. Thanks for listening, and let's get started.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. USPIE's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at USPIE on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit USPIE.org.
We have another great show for you today. I have a very special guest, someone who's been instrumental in some of the growth we've experienced here at USPIE in the last few years. With me today is Joaquin Fernandez, the filmmaker behind our documentary film, Truth and Lies in American Education, which we will be discussing today in detail. In the very first episode of this podcast, I interviewed my daughter-in-law, April Few, and she kind of interviewed me as well. And we talked about not only the origins of USPIE, but also April's story, and she shared what it was like to be the protagonist of the Truth and Lies film. Well, today we're going to hear what went on behind the scenes during the production of the film. Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri. I'll be back with my interview with Joaquin Fernandez right after this. U.S. Parents Involved in Education has developed a game-changing blueprint to establish state control of education. This visionary initiative aims to restore state sovereignty, enhance student learning, and safeguard parental rights. Our blueprint challenges the influence of the U.S. Department of Education, criticized for financial coercion and mandates that may not truly serve our children. Here are 4 steps. Step 1. Analyze education funds from federal, state, and local sources. Step 2. Conduct a comprehensive cost of compliance study. Step 3. Identify state programs to replace existing U.S. Department of Education initiatives with active involvement from parents and communities. And Step 4, shift the responsibility of education revenue back to the state. Join us next week for more insights from U.S. parents involved in education. Visit USPIE.org or connect with us at USPIE on Facebook and Twitter. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri. I am your host, Sheri, and today I have with me the man behind USPIE's documentary film, Truth and Lies in American Education, Joaquin Fernandez.
Thanks for having me on the show. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Before we start our conversation, I'd like to let our listeners know a little bit about you. So let me read your bio real quick. Joaquin Fernandez is a seasoned documentary filmmaker whose work spans much of the United States and many other countries in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. Joaquin studied filmmaking at New York University, and he worked with several advertising agencies in Miami before providing communication solutions for higher education, government, and nonprofits. As founder of Great Commission Films, Joaquin has produced multiple documentaries, including, of course, Truth and Lies in American Education, as well as Indoctrination, Public Schools and the Decline of Christianity in America, which is how I first heard of him. His current projects include Hero in America, Dr. Kishore and the Epidemic of Greed, a documentary film exploring a groundbreaking approach to treating America's drug crisis, and a screenplay for a narrative feature film, The Major, that follows four college friends as they confront the legacy of Civil War-era entrepreneur and Confederate Major James Lide Coker in their small college town of Hartsville, South Carolina, amidst America's social tensions of 2020. Joaquin is also the producer of the latest versions of GriefShare and DivorceCare, two video-based curricula used in tens of thousands of churches worldwide. He and his wife, Monica, live in the beautiful North Carolina foothills north of Charlotte. So welcome, Joaquin. What an impressive resume.
One more thing that's not in my bio is that Monica and I became grandparents recently of a healthy, beautiful young boy. We're just enjoying uh, being grandparents for the first time. I'm sure you know all about that since you have grandkids as well.
Oh, yes, and congratulations. That's awesome, Joaquin. Grandchildren are the joy of our lives. So I first reached out to you in January of 2019, 6 years ago now. Wow, can't believe it's been 6 years. And I approached you with my idea of making a documentary film. I had watched Indoctrination, and the USPIE board was looking for a way to inform Americans about the multitude of serious issues in government schools. We needed to sound the alarm and wake parents and other citizens up to understand that children are being harmed and our country's freedom is being threatened. Do you remember that?
Wow, 6 years ago, huh? That's crazy. Um, yeah, I remember because we have a mutual friend, Ray Moore, of the Exodus Mandate in Columbia, South Carolina. We used to live in Columbia, South Carolina, and I used to volunteer with Ray, and he's the director of the Exodus Mandate, which is uh, an organization calling Christian parents to remove their children from public schools to give them a Christian education, either private education, Christian education, or by homeschooling them. And I met Ray years ago, and I used to volunteer for him once a week. And so, in fact, Indoctrination, the film that you mentioned earlier that you saw and prompted you to call me about doing a documentary for USPIE, he was an executive producer and it actually originated in conversations with him, with Ray Moore. Later, of course, I partnered with a Scottish filmmaker that lives in Texas, Colin Gunn, who's in Indoctrination and is a co-producer, co-director with me. But yeah, it all started with Ray Moore, and so yeah, I was glad that he connected us, or that you heard about the film or watched the film and reached out to me all those years ago.
Well, yes, I remember thinking Indoctrination was such a compelling film because it had a storyline. It wasn't a dry, boring documentary, as most of them are, just full of facts. So I love that it had a storyline. It really brought it to life. And that's the reason I reached out to you for our film. And you've done a wonderful job in our film doing the same thing, creating the storyline. So before you tell us how you went about structuring the film, let's play the trailer for Truth and Lies in American Education.
Public school is the instituted agency of socialism throughout every community.
The U.S. government has no authority to have any role in education.
We're going to lose our very republic if we don't stop this indoctrination of children in government schools.
What happened to us in China can't happen here.
Have one kind of education and then call it equity.
It's about outcomes. It's about trying to force us all to be equal.
I think we're going to have a race civil war in our hands.
We're exposing kids to pornography as early as kindergarten. Parents just don't know.
No, not anymore. Not anymore. Parents need to wake up. They don't have the interests of your child at heart.
So Joaquin, how did you come up with an outline for the film?
Well, like you mentioned before, story is everything. There, without a story, you don't really have a film. And a lot of documentaries are storyless, I guess. Some of them are, it's just like you said, an enumeration of facts. Um, but that's really not compelling. And although you had a particular message, that we didn't have to come up with that. You knew what you stand for, what you're trying to communicate. We needed a story, and you mentioned to me early on. You mentioned that April, you gave her all these books to read, and then she, because she started working with USPIE, and she was going to be a mother and have to answer that question of what education I would give to my child. And so I thought, well, there's a story right there. April should be the protagonist. Um, you kind of hinted at that anyway, and it seemed like this is a good story. The story of someone whose eyes are open to the realities of what's happening in the government schools, which actually is a way for the audience to identify with that person, and hopefully have their eyes open. And so um, from there, structuring the film was okay. So what were the books? Uh, Alex Newman was one of the authors. He co-wrote a book with Blumenfeld. Um, Sam Sorbo's book, perhaps maybe that was not on the initial list. But Donna Hearn, etc. There were several books, several authors, and so we said, well, why not tell the story of her meeting these people and asking them questions about some of the things that she read in their books. So it seemed like a natural way of doing it. Um, and so there were opportunities to do that at different conferences. There was an education conference that the late Donna Hearn uh, ran for many years that you guys go to. And there was a homeschool convention in I think it was in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where Sam Sorbo was. So we went there and filmed April looking at books, checking out curricula, etc. Um, there was an event where uh, in was it in Greenville, South Carolina, where Carol Swain came, and actually it's always helpful to have interviews in the context of events, a conference, because what in the film world we call B-roll, A-roll is the interview, right? And this goes back to the days of actual film reels, and so like an A-roll and a B-roll. A-roll is in documentary filmmaking is what you film the interview, right? And in our case, we did it with 2 cameras, but it's still one interview. B-roll is the footage of either them doing something or complementary footage to show what they're talking about or something like that. And so when you go to an event, as a conference, a convention, or like a speaking event in Greenville, we had the opportunity to do B-roll, not only of the speakers interacting with audiences or walking down a hallway or whatever, but more importantly, interacting with April. And so that just brings to life her journey of discovery. And then the other thing that we did also, and April's just such a sweetheart. She's just great. Um, we would talk to her before meeting someone like Sam Sorbo, for example. And we went to a pizza place. We had to have lunch, so we just recorded that. I'm off camera, but she's talking to me, and how are you feeling about what, because this is like it's like a Hollywood person, and an author of a book and someone you're looking up to, what are you feeling? And then when she gets to meet her, we actually kind of, I don't know if we rented or just they donated a time, some restaurant that was closed for certain hours in the afternoon. And we shot that interview there at a different restaurant. And then, but also we would interview her after the fact, like she was in her car, or for many of these interviews, we interviewed her like a follow-up of her interview of the expert. And so that gave us also an emotional reaction from her. And in one occasion, at least, she was very teary-eyed. Uh, she was crying, just thinking, and that's actually how we end the film. You know, she has this burden for other parents that don't know, even her peers. And so very beautiful. So there is a kind of a story arc, a character arc. There's other, as you remember, we divided the film in chapters, and we can talk about that.
Right.
If
Well,
you like.
before we get into that, let's take a quick break. And when we get back, we'll talk about what happens behind the scenes in a production like this. And how do you go about filming and editing everything into something that makes sense? So don't go away. We'll be right back after this. Unlocking a brighter future for education is within reach, and it only takes 4 simple steps with U.S. Parents Involved in Education's blueprint to establish state control of education. Today, let's explore the blueprint's first 2 steps. Step 1, discover the impact. Calculate the percentage of education spending that comes from the federal government in your state. Surprisingly, for most states, it's just around 10%. It may seem like a small fraction, but understanding its significance is key. Step 2, unravel the ties that bind. Conduct a cost of compliance study to reveal the hidden costs attached to federal dollars. Some districts have found innovative ways to replace federal programs, saving money and improving services. These 2 initial steps shed light on the delicate balance between federal funding and state control, showing how states have traded a lot of control for relatively little money. Join us next week for more insights into U.S. Parents Involved in Education. Visit USPIE.org or connect with us at USPIE on Facebook and Twitter. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I am your host, Sheri Few, and I'm here with Joaquin Fernandez, and we're discussing the making of USPIE's film, Truth and Lies in American Education. So how did you go about filming and editing all of that footage into something that makes sense, Joaquin?
We filmed with 2 cameras. Most, if not all, of the interviews. It's just an easy way to edit. It facilitates editing. So when you have 2 cameras, if you only have 1 camera and you need to take something out, the interviewee is doing something or they mess up and they say, "Let me say that again." Well, you don't want to show all that. But if you have 2 cameras, you can cut to the other angle of the person, and then there's a close-up, and then there's the wide shot. It's just easy to hide the mistakes by having to. So, but you end up with a lot more footage, twice as much footage, which is more hard drive space. You'll remember that we had to hey, Sheri, we need to buy another hard drive. So, there's lighting considerations, and the set needs to be a certain way so that you can have 2 cameras and 2 angles and stuff like that. But filming all this, I don't do all that by myself. I have a colleague. If anybody goes to truthandliesfilm.us, which is the website for the film, they'll see somewhere cast and credit. I think we ended up interviewing about 15 people, including you and April. But the crew, that's kind of the cast, although you're an executive producer, obviously. But the crew was myself as producer director, Patrick Dunnigan, who's a dear friend of mine and colleague, who was the cinematographer, meaning the person in charge of the look of it, of all the footage, and operating the main camera, and being in charge of that. And then there's a second cameraman, and then sometimes a production assistant. So to do that, and so, but it's a very small crew. I've worked on other projects that have a lot more people, but for this was a small crew. We had a budget, and obviously, and then post-production, which is editing and all that. The actual structure of the film, not only the story, the narrative, and you and I worked on that together, got it approved by the board. Okay, what is the structure of the film? What are the topics that we want to cover? Because yes, there's the story of April meeting these people and asking them questions and her kind of character arc. But again, you had a message that you wanted to convey. And so we needed to cover a number of topics. And so we went back and forth with that and came up with what is the content that you wanted to communicate to the audience. And so what we ended up doing was, based on that, breaking it up, like I mentioned before, in chapters. And so I don't remember them right now, but I think there's like 7 or 8 sort of segments. And but one is on the sexualization of children, and not in this order. Another one was about critical race theory. Another one was about revisionist history. Another one was about Marxism. When Lily Tang Williams, who was born in China and educated and escaped communist China under Mao, she tells her story in the film, and interacts with April. So that gave us sort of a skeleton for post-production, for editing. And then, of course, there's all the other stuff. What additional footage can we get? And if I remember correctly, we might have actually said, hey, we might have filmed the people that we did not foresee. We didn't even know existed. Like at the conference was it in St. Louis?
Yes, it was
the
St.
educational
Louis.
conference, I think. Yeah, we met someone who used to be a superintendent of education or something like that, or board. I don't know what.
She was on the state board of education in Alabama. Yes.
Right. So we interviewed her. That was great. There was a lady who was a historian, Mary Graybar or something.
Graybar.
She wrote a book. Right. And so we interviewed her. We interviewed this other young guy who's kind of a historian. And so we end up with things that perhaps we didn't anticipate. Some of them we did, but yeah, we make it work, and it always takes way longer than we think, right? And I'm sure I'm grateful for your patience and vision, because these things take longer than you think. I would be embarrassed to look at my initial proposal and schedule, because, as you said, we started the conversation 6 years ago here soon. And the film was released, I'm going to say 3 years after we started, really, the release of it. But these things take a couple of years typically, and then life happens. COVID, we were in the middle of the COVID craziness and all that stuff, and other projects that I was working on. So you were very gracious. So that's kind of how we did it.
I was just going to add the fun fact that we all ended up with COVID. After the last filming episode, April had COVID. The end of the film, I don't know how she made it through. She had a high fever, and God was just showing his grace, I guess, then. But then we all ended up with it because she had it. So yeah, it was an eventful couple of years, but it was very worthwhile. I think the film is fantastic. We get lots of good reviews on it all the time. And, it's something we might want to look at doing more of in the future. So let me ask you something else. So what are your thoughts on the future of education in America, especially now that President Trump is about to return to the White House, vowing to fulfill his promise of closing the U.S. Department of Education, which is the mission of United States parents involved in education?
Yeah, well, by nature, I think I'm an optimist. I'm not pessimistic about pretty much nothing, really, honestly. I mean, I'm a Christian, and I know God has I have a theology and even an eschatology of victory. I believe that things are meant to get better and better, even if sometimes we think, and even many Christians think, like, oh, things are supposed to get worse and worse. I don't subscribe to that. I'm typically optimistic. So even in this new atmosphere that we're in, um, interestingly, IndoctriNation, the previous film on education that I did, is called IndoctriNation: Public Schools and the Decline of Christianity in America, right? So I think that's as far as my pessimism goes. There was a decline of Christianity because of the public school system. I think was designed, and people can check that film out, really to undermine our values, and this is what we're having today. But to answer your question, there is I'm optimistic about what's happening in our nation politically, because in a way, we have a new Republican Party now, of sorts. Trump has basically redone the party at many levels, but there's even a new coalition of sorts forming around Trump's second term. As we all know, we have RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, and others that are former liberals or, in the traditional sense, and Democrats, that have come to be part of the administration, and that's kind of an interesting dynamic that I think, for example, with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy coming in as kind of disruptors under Trump's leadership, this draining of the swamp that they talk about is now, I think, a real possibility, and that the Department of Education, now with their Department of Government Efficiency, Doge, that probably is going to be, in the chopping block now for real. Ronald Reagan promised to close the Department of Education, and he didn't, and many others have, and they didn't. And Trump actually said he would, and he didn't in the first term, if I'm correct. So now I think there might be a mandate for it, the political sort of capital to do it, and a team of shakers, really, and movers that are disruptors in a sense that I think they might actually go ahead and do it. Now, that might be a process, and I think you, as an organization, USPIE, has an amazing opportunity to be part of that message of, hey, we need to really rethink a lot of things that we have taken for granted, that we've just grown accustomed to, and many of these things are being questioned, politically and otherwise. And I think people, after COVID and seeing how horrible their kids' education was, and conversely, how many parents welcomed a relationship with their kids, because they had them in home. They were homeschooling, as it were, during the pandemic or during the lockdowns and all that. And so all of this is possibly a perfect storm, I think, for you guys to really be able to play a major role in the shifting of the paradigm of people, particularly parents, about not only the education of their children, but also the money that goes to Washington, D.C. and gets, swallowed up, or, goes sinks to the bottom of the swamp, as it were. So I think at the time is just right for some real structural change to happen, and a return of not only the dollars, but also the focus and the responsibility of education to the local level, and so they can be controlled by parents.
So, Joaquin, what are your thoughts on the future of education in America, especially now that President Trump is vowing to fulfill the promise of closing the U.S. Department of Education?
I actually am optimistic by nature, and I think now is probably a perfect storm. The Republican Party is different than it used to be, in large part because of Trump. We are seeing a coalition from various corners. We have former Democrats like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. joining the administration. We have liberals in the classical sense as Elon Musk. We have people like Vivek Ramaswamy and Musk in the Department of Government Efficiency, looking at ways to cut waste and just, inefficiency and things like that. So I think now, with the mandate that President Trump has, we have a good chance of seeing the Department of Education be on that chopping block, the federal Department of Education. And also there are other things, like even with the whole, abortion question, of returning that back to the states, sort of like a federalist view of law. And so I think that chances are high, I think, and I'm optimistic, that the federal Department of Education will finally be closed, and monies will be sent back to the states, and then sort of this wave of decentralization and shrinking of the federal government will end up being a plus for parents of school age children whose, property taxes go to pay for education at the state level. But, there's so many things, as you know better than anybody, that are superimposed on what parents want for the education of their children because they're tied to federal dollars. And so there's a lack of local control. You have a plan for shutting down the Department of Education and what the ripple effect of that would be, and how to do that. And I think you guys are in a perfect situation to become even more impactful with your message and your plan, and in some way kind of coalesce with the movement that's happening in the country at the federal level. And hopefully, somebody in a high place will hear of you and maybe even partner. And I think that one way or the other, your grassroots movement is a good way, because it's kind of like, if it's coming from the top, but it's also, you've been working with local communities across the country to make people aware of the need for a return to local control of education. So I think it's a perfect storm.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Joaquin. It is our mission, and I believe it's our time, and I believe it's an idea whose time has come. So we're pretty excited about the opportunities that are before us. In fact, we recently updated our blueprint for how to close the U.S. Department of Education that we published in 2017. We're about to republish it and print enough copies to get it into the hands of every decision maker in Washington and states. So we're pretty excited about this opportunity. And so before we close, and this is a complete...
You know what? I'm actually curious, Sheri, if you don't mind me interrupting, if we have a minute or so, I'm interested in knowing how do you, because you have a vantage point, how do you see, how are you feeling about 2025, 2026, et cetera, the next 4 years when it comes to what you want to accomplish? And the same question that you asked me, basically.
Well, I think the timing is perfect. Discussions are being had all over the country about the idea of closing the Department of Ed. Parents are fed up with the wokeness happening in the schools, and even when state legislatures, are passing laws to try to prevent it, the federal government comes in and mandates more and threatens to withhold funding if they don't comply. So, everything is working together perfectly right now. It's coming together for us to have this opportunity to influence public policy. I know when we first adopted our mission nearly 10 years ago now, it sounded like a good campaign platform speech, or, lots of people like to say they're going to close it. But who's ever developed a plan? No one that we're aware of. So we took the time in 2017 and developed a plan that is detailed for how it can happen, for how we can shut down programs one at a time and shift the revenues back to the states. So we have a very feasible plan. It's a detailed plan, as I said. We have to be really careful too, though, because I've already seen some legislation coming out of Congress that says we could move the programs into other federal agencies, and that's not going to cure the problem. We have to get rid of all the federal involvement in education, not just closing the Department of Education, but there's some laws that will have to be changed too to end this intrusion. So it is an exciting time for our organization, and we're right here doing lots of interviews, which I've talked about, and starting with this podcast, we're hoping to really capture the attention of those who are in charge of this task so that we can help them with our vision and our blueprint. So before we close...
There's no one better than you to do that.
Oh, well, thank you. Okay, so before we close our time, and this is a complete hypothetical question for you, what would you say a sequel to Truth and Lies in American Education would look like? Where would you start when it comes to a sequel's content?
That's a great question. The Truth and Lies in American Education, the film, is it's not quite a sequel to IndoctriNation, but it's a follow-up of sorts. A lot of people asked us, hey, when are you guys going to do a sequel? And that film came out in 2011. So a lot of the information is outdated. And the information in Truth and Lies is not outdated yet, obviously. But, in due course, everything has a timestamp. And so, and a shelf life, as it were. But, to answer your question, I think it would all have to start with story again, where we started. And, we told April's story and her kind of character arc. But I think there's, maybe it would include her homeschool journey, a little bit, maybe pick up with her. It could be a little bit of a follow up on that. But there's an untold story, as far as I know, of grandparents, people like you. You got involved. You're a volunteer in your own organization. You're doing this because it's a mission, it's a calling. And there are so many grandparents, and you mentioned in my introduction that I'm working on a film on the opioid epidemic. And so many grandparents have had to come in and take, more so, disproportionately so, care of their grandkids because their parents, are either, afflicted with drug addiction or dead, sadly. And so grandparents having to step up in that scenario is kind of tragic. But in our scenario here is a rallying call. Parents sometimes, well, often, when you're raising kids, that's what you're doing. You're raising kids. You're putting food on the table. You've got, your two working parents out of the house, and what are you going to do, right? You can't afford, necessarily like a private school. So, but sometimes, as we chronicled in the film when we interviewed Ray Moore, he said his sister is assisting in the homeschooling of her granddaughter because her daughter, Ray's niece, is a single mom. And so here's grandma, who may be retired, has extra time. She's getting involved in the education. But people like you and many, many others across the nation are getting involved, grandparents, in policy, like in advocacy, because they have the time, the resources, the wisdom, to kind of get involved, right? And so I think grandparents coming out as advocates and building relationships with lawmakers, they have time to call, their representative, et cetera, to run for school board, that kind of thing. That collective wisdom that's a story in and of itself. And so I think that could be also used as a rallying call, a call to action, like, for you guys. But again, you said, it's a hypothetical. So, but that's kind of probably where I would go and see what happens in the next several years, politically and sort of the national environment when it comes to education.
Well, that sounds great. I appreciate your input on that. And it's been a desire of mine for at least a year now for us to take on another project. So, God willing, we'll look into some of that. So this has been a great conversation, Joaquin. Thank you for being on the show and for everything you're still doing for USPIE, including producing this podcast. So thanks again for being on.
Absolutely. It's been fun. And, I'm 100% supportive of what you guys are doing. Monica and I homeschooled our own kids, and we are hoping that they will do the same, give them a Christian education. And, anything that we could do to help, that, our hand is on the plow. And congratulations on your growth. And I am excited to see what 2025 and beyond is in store for you and your organization. The growth, I think, is going to be exponential. So I'm excited about USPIE.
Well, thank you again, Joaquin. Yeah, I'm mindful of the fact that when we first got connected, I had no idea where we were going to get the money from to produce this film. I think we raised about $150,000 to do it, and it was such a blessing, all of the different ways that God provided for us the ability to do this. And then since then, it's really caused more growth for us. So we're pretty excited too. So thank you again, Joaquin, and join me again next week for another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I'll be joined by Melanie Curtis, president of USPIE's Michigan chapter. She's an accomplished businesswoman, educator, researcher, activist, and co-founder of Stop Common Core Michigan. Melanie is also an active member of USPIE's board of directors, and she'll be with us next week on another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. See you then.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, USPIE seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional USPIE chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapters section.